Hello and welcome to episode 407 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm good. I am, I feel like I've got steam coming out of my ears, to be honest, because all of us at Money to the Masses have been really hectic at the moment because we're juggling a number of projects that have all come in sort of fruition at the same time, which people may not, well, they won't be aware of many of them actually, because we've not announced them. So on that note, people will have noticed that they got the first episode of our Grow It campaign. Now, Grow It was a campaign that we did for the first time last year, which was to teach people how to start investing, to educate them about investing. We've done a new campaign this year to help those of you who haven't started investing or thought about it to understand how it works and hopefully have a stepping stone into being able to. And so this series is a series of 10 videos which principally live on YouTube, but we are putting the audio on the podcast. So if you like the podcast, you want to see some of the things I might mention that obviously don't translate to a podcast, then go onto our YouTube channel. You can subscribe to the channel and therefore see the episodes as they're released. We're releasing them in this March on a Tuesday and a Thursday. So the next episode is coming out this Tuesday, and I cover everything from who you should think about investing, things you should think about before you start, which is the next episode. Those episodes are quite short, but then the videos will get a bit longer as I explore other areas of investing, including things like I touch upon taxation, I touch upon risk versus reward, and your options out there when you're looking to invest. And I even touch upon investing for your children and investing ethically. So if you've listened to our podcast series and you wanted to start investing or learn a little bit more, this is the easy route into that to help educate people. So that has been a lot of work by the team to get that to happen. I did forget to mention it last week on the podcast actually, so you had a nice Brucey bonus when it dropped in. Another project that we're working on at the same time is a project relating to the female orientated content that we're putting out. So it is International Women's Day on the 8th of March this year, and over the last couple of months we've been pulling together some content, and actually I'm doing a couple of interviews with people who can provide some really good insight. Now, I think it's not just for our female audience, but I think the male part of our audience will also find it very interesting. One of the people I'm going to interview will deal with working and career and having a baby. And the second person I'm going to be interviewing deals with helping mums get back to work. And that can be after having a baby, or it could actually be women who are trying to go back to work after the menopause. So they're very interesting people that I've actually asked to come onto the podcast. I've met them through my line of work and what we do at Money to the Masses, and I've eventually nailed them down to come onto the podcast. It's taken me quite a while to do that. And one of the pieces of content on this week's podcast actually has been inspired by a lot of that work I've been doing over the last couple of months. And before I move on, Andy, can I just ask that everybody leaves a review of the podcast? It's particularly inspiring for us to get the reviews. This week, there's a lot on the podcast. I probably could have put each of these three pieces as main pieces on separate podcasts, but I got carried away and I've put it all into one. So I've got to get through it pretty quick. There's a lot of insight in there. One other thing I just want to mention before we move on is that we've started publishing a roundup of the best mortgage rates on the Money to the Masses website. So we've got a calculator that you can use that can compare the best mortgage rates out there. And I put some stuff out on Instagram, which just highlighted what the current best rates are, and it proved very popular. So we're now doing a roundup that you can just look at the post and see what the best 2-year fixed rates are, best 5-year fixed rates. Of course, the rate you will get will depend on your circumstances and your loan to value, but you will find this useful because if you're one of the millions who are looking to remortgage in particular this year, you will be keeping an eye on the rates of those mortgages. And one thing I will point out is that fixed term mortgage rates had come down after this spike at the end of 2022, and we were around or just below 4% on a 5-year fixed, and we were just above 4% on a 2-year fixed. Well, recent economic data has meant that markets are starting to bet that we may see more rate rises in the future, but more importantly, interest rates might be higher for longer. So we've seen those best rates drop away as they've been either pulled or they've increased. So we are now looking at 4% seems to be where we're sitting now. And I think we might be there for a while. So it's an easy way for you to keep an eye on what's going on with rates so you can plan ahead with your budgeting. So, another thing I'll quickly mention, Andy and I are interviewing a podcast listener for an upcoming show, which will be interesting. So that is something else separate. So all of this stuff that's going on is really exciting.
It is indeed, Damien. And as you said, this is a particularly busy episode with lots coming up. So why don't we explain what the listeners will get in this week's episode?
So the piece I wanted to do that is particularly relevant this week, being International Women's Day, is the gender pension gap. I'll explain more about what that is. And it's not just something for the female audience. It's going to impact men as well. And there'll be plenty of people out there who are employers. There will be a lot of insight in there for you as well. CGT planning, I've been promising it since the end of 2022 when the Chancellor announced changes to the CGT allowance, so the capital gains tax allowance. It's starting to drop this year and next year. So you're going to have a smaller allowance, which you don't have to pay tax on when you make a capital gain in a tax year. What do you need to do now to plan for that reduction? And finally, I'm going to give you an update on a piece of research I completed for 80/20 investor members. Every year I look at funds and analyze them. It takes me weeks to analyze the income payouts of hundreds of funds so they can see which ones can provide a reliable income stream if they invest in them. Because there are a lot of investors out there that are investing for income. Not everybody is looking for capital gains. Some people invest for income principally. So these heat maps help them. I want to give some insights from the analysis that I carried out on that piece of research.
Okay, so let's move on to the first piece then, the gender pension gap. Now, I know we've covered in previous podcasts before, and I've personally had to deal with something called the gender pay gap, which many people may have heard, is where organisations now have to publicise and publish the pay gap that exists between their male and female colleagues based on a number of criteria, including bonuses and pay. And so that's the gender pay gap, which certain companies of a certain size have to report to various people and actually publish it on their website if they have one. So Damien, we're going to focus on the gender pension gap, explaining what it is and what the problems are.
Yeah, and we're also going to look at some of the potential solutions. And I'm not going to solve the gender pension gap in this podcast because there's a whole host of things that need to change, and some of them at a society level. And I will give some tips that women might find useful in the current unequal pension world they currently find themselves in. So just to start off, it's difficult to define what the gender pension gap is because there is no official definition. So there are lots of different ways it's been looked at, and Aviva have done a great piece of research which is going to be the focal point of this part of the podcast, and I'm going to talk around it. And they have tried to highlight the gender pension gap by looking at the differences in retirement outcomes for men and women. And they've done this by looking at 5 million pension plans. And what the research showed is that there are some big differences in the amount paid in pension contributions between men and women. And that has a big impact on retirement income. And not only that, the stark differences that the research highlights, that imbalance persists into retirement, with women aged 60 to 65 having a pension pot which on average is half the size of a man's pension pot of the same age. So to give that some context, if we were to say a man at age 65 was to go and purchase an annuity with their pension pot, then if they had £100,000, they went and purchased a single life annuity that was level, so the income didn't increase, and there were no guarantee period, so when they died, no matter how soon they died, the annuity would stop paying, they would get £6,637 a year. So that's 6.6% annuity rate. If they were a smoker, they would get £7,448. So that's about 7.5% annuity rate. Don't forget, when you get to an annuity, smoking or having some form of health issue can actually give you a better income. It's one of the few times in life where those normally negative aspects have a positive impact financially. And if you look at women by comparison, given that their pension pot at that age would be 57% of an equivalent man's pension pot, that means if they had £100,000, they would only get £3,783 if they were a non-smoker every year. If they were a smoker, they'd get £4,245 every year. That's a big difference when you're looking at pounds and pence. So the research produced a neat table that summarised by age the gap in the pension contributions between men and women. And I'm not going to read them all out because it wouldn't be great on the podcast, but we will put a link in the show notes where you can go through and find a copy of this table if you're interested. But just to pick out a few, at the age 20 to 24, then there is a 15% gap between men and women's pension contributions. As you start to move up the age groups, that creeps up to about 17% between the ages of 30 and 34. So that's the gap. So men are putting more into their pensions. Then what happens is at that point, at 35 to 39, the gap starts to diverge and widen. So at 35 to 39, by that point, the gap is 21%. So men are putting significantly more into their pensions on average. This is taken as an average across those 5 million pension plans when they're analysed. Then as you go up, by the time that you get to age 55, that is 35%, and then at age 60, it's 38%. They're huge differences. And so that then explains why the pension pots, when they get to age 60, 65, are so much lower than men's. So why is it that at the age 35 to 39 we start to see a greater divergence? Well, it's because partly at that stage women are having to make career and childcare decisions and even considering starting to work part-time. And that therefore starts to impact their pension contributions. Now, there is an important consideration that if you are planning to go part-time and you have that choice, that you understand the impact that it will have on pension contributions going forward and the ultimate impact on your final pension pot. So there's an element of financial planning that needs to take place. And so there is a consideration whether women might want to up their pension contributions during that period or when they go back to work. But of course, you've got to balance this off against disposable income. And not always is there a decision to be made, if that makes sense, because of the life circumstance, then they might not always be able to pay more into their pension because of more pressing financial commitments. But it also does raise this interesting point that if, for example, they were in a relationship and they were thinking about the career and childcare options and decisions at that point when they're having a child, then it does make sense to look at the impact. Hopefully, as a couple, you'll be together into retirement, because it may be that the partner may be better off going part-time or reducing their hours, because it may be possible that if you look at their contracts, that maybe the mum-to-be might get greater matched employer pension contributions than, say, their partner. In which case, that needs to be brought into the decision-making process, which isn't widely talked about. Now, looking at those numbers, before I move on and start thinking about possible solutions to this problem, solutions I say in inverted commas, are really things that you could probably do now that may help the problem. They won't eradicate it. Is that the pension gap from age 45 onwards has reduced in the last year. So if you go back to the numbers when they were published a year ago, the pension gap at 60 to 64, that age group, was 45%. Now it's down to 38. So yeah, it's still a big gap. But when you look at the numbers, it seems to be that perhaps that women are starting to recognise the gap that exists and looking to take some kind of action to help reduce it. So none of this will be news to our female listeners out there, but it probably will be news to a lot of male listeners out there, and also people who are employers, because as a society, we've got to try and reduce this gap. Ultimately, we want to eradicate it. So one of the things that does need to happen is we do need to define what the gender pension gap is, because if you can quantify something properly, then you can start to try and measure it and control it. So going back to what Andy mentioned at the beginning of this piece, with the gender pay gap, large companies are being forced to have to publicise the gap that exists in their pay between male and female employees. And then that will hopefully in time encourage that gap to be narrowed. We need to have a similar thing, gender pension gap. Need it publicised, and then hopefully we can get it narrowed. The other thing that people have to realise, that this isn't a case of women just not wanting to pay into a pension. So Aviva's way of looking at the gender pension gap is to look at the contribution levels. And of course, some people might look at that and just say, well, women aren't paying in as much. That's oversimplifying it. There are reasons why they aren't paying in as much. They'd love to pay in more, no doubt, and have a bigger pension, but there are reasons why they can't, which is fairly obvious. One of the things is when you've got the pay gap that exists, of course, they are going to be paying in less into a pension because they're being paid less. So the gender pay gap is part of the problem as well, but it's not the only problem. If we look at auto-enrollment does help to a point to try and create some equality in terms of contribution levels. So based on a percentage, as you know, that if you are employed, you're above the qualifying earnings levels, you're earning more than £10,000, then you will be paying in. If you're auto-enrolled, you will be automatically. So if you opt out, you won't, but you'll be paying in 5% a year and your employer will be paying in 3% of the qualifying earnings, or however your scheme is set up. Now, of course, putting the pay issue to one side, there is something that could be changed about auto-enrollment that would help more women. There is a lower limit for qualifying earnings. So if you earn less than £10,000, you are not automatically enrolled into your company's pension scheme. If you earn less than £6,240, then you won't be in any way auto-enrolled into your pension scheme. You can ask to join it, but your employer isn't obliged to pay into it. So what we need to do is change the rules so that people who are working part-time, who earn less, then they start getting employer contributions from the very first pound that they earn. That would help, because when people start to reduce their hours, maybe after they've had a child, then they will still be getting pension contributions paid in, because some people may not choose to go back to the job they had before, so they may be working part-time for an extended period of time. That could have an impact. So we need more pressure on governments to change the rules to benefit those who are working part-time, and by logic, that will impact a lot of women. The other thing is, I mentioned that women are probably decided to have to solve this problem themselves, which isn't ideal. They've started to reduce the gap at the older age ranges because they've decided to do something about it. Now, one of the things they can do is to check their state pension. We produced podcast 405 where we talked about the pension boost deadline. We're talking about the state pension. Go and listen to that podcast for how you can make sure that you have a complete national insurance record to make sure that you are going to get a full state pension, and that will help you in retirement. So it's nicely joined up. You can see how we've been doing this. That podcast came before this one because we can just refer you to that one to go and listen to it. Also, you have to make sure that if you are claiming child benefit, if you have a child, because you get those free NI credits until your youngest child is aged 12, and they can go on your national insurance record if you're not working, and therefore can help you get a full state pension. In podcast 405, we did touch upon what they would call the grandparent credit. So it's not unique to grandparents, but if you're a grandparent and you are looking after a child under the age of 12, and let's say the parents have had to go back to work, you can technically get the national insurance credit that's associated with that child benefit accredited to you. And you have to apply to have that done. It does mean that the person receiving the child benefit has to agree to it, but we'll put a link in the show notes where you can find out more information about that. I've already mentioned that if you are thinking about reducing your hours, then you might want to consider whether it's better for you or your partner to work part-time, particularly if you get the higher employer pension contributions. And of course, this piece of advice goes for anybody. Start as early as you can when it comes to contributing into a pension, even if it's a small amount, but it won't eradicate it, because those problems still exist when women typically get to their mid-30s when it comes to the changes to their career. The other things you can obviously do is look for lost pensions. We'll put a link in the show notes about that, but you go to the pension tracing service. And of course, there are the options of delaying accessing your pension, be it your state pension or your private pension. With your state pension, it means it will increase the amount you actually receive when you start claiming it. Again, we'll put a link in the show notes for more information about that. But also, if you delay claiming your personal pension, then theoretically you could allow it to grow further. Obviously, depending on what the markets do and how you're invested, that may mean that you could get a slightly higher income in retirement. Now, I want to take one jump back, because I did mention about your employer's pension scheme if you earn less than £10,000. Now, make sure you join the scheme, because under auto-enrollment, if you earn between £6,240 and £10,000, you won't be invited to join, but you can, and they will have to pay into it under the terms of auto-enrollment. So you will get a 3% contribution minimum as long as you're paying in your 5. Now, the other reason why, if you're not in your employer's pension scheme and you are able to join it, it is beneficial to be in the scheme before before you have children. Because if you're employed, then your employer must continue to contribute to your pension scheme if you're a member. Now, that has a big implication, because what happens if you're getting statutory maternity pay? Again, I'll put a link in the show notes to give you a lot more information about this. But what happens when it comes to your pension? Your employer has to pay contributions to the pension, assuming you're a member, and they were paying them before you went on maternity leave. They pay the contribution based on your pay before you went on maternity leave. Your employer has to pay those contributions to your pension up to 39 weeks and possibly longer if your employer offers it in your contract. Now, when you are on maternity leave and you're entitled to statutory maternity pay, your contributions will be based on what you actually are paid. So as your earnings fall, then the percentage that's applied to that will be a smaller amount in pounds. That's the amount you pay into your pension. But your employer has to pay into your pension based upon the pay you were getting before you went on maternity leave. So that is a big difference. So you want to be a member of the scheme before you go on maternity leave. As I said, I'll put a link into the notes of the podcast where you can find out more information. It does technically mean if your pay falls below the qualifying level, you won't actually technically pay anything in some instances, but your employer still will do. So that is something I'm not sure everybody knows. So there are decisions to be made before you even have a child that can have an impact on your pension off into the future. So there you go, Andy. A bit of planning. There's a lot that we need to do as a society in terms of equality, in terms of pay, also in terms of legislation, how we define it, how we eradicate it. As employers, you obviously can choose to pay people more during maternity or whatever it is you want to do. So there are things that you can think about, and you may not actually realise quite the gap that appears in people's pensions when they have to make life decisions. So you might decide to review your policies after you've listened to this podcast. Oh, before I move on, Andy, two quick things I thought about there. Keep pensions in the forefront of your mind when it comes to things like divorce. People don't often realise that sharing pensions is part of a divorce or dissolution of a civil partnership in the same way as other assets. And also, if you are in a relationship, then this will impact you even if it's not you who's going to be giving birth to the child, because you've got to think of this in the round as financial planning, that what makes the best sense financially going forward when you hopefully will be sharing a retirement together. There's a lot to think about.
Okay, so let's move on to CGT then, capital gains tax. There's some changes afoot, and Damien, you're going to explain what it means for people.
Right, so going back to the autumn, the Chancellor announced that the CGT allowance and actually the dividend tax allowance were going to be reduced going forward. So at the moment, you've got CGT allowance, a capital gains tax allowance of £12,300. That means in a given tax year, if you sell something and you've made a profit of £12,300, you don't pay tax on it. Above that, you then start paying tax. And the way it's worked out, you work out what your taxable income is, then you take away your personal allowance and any income tax reliefs from that. Then you work out what your taxable gain is and remove any taxable losses, I'll come on to those in a minute, from that to provide the amount that could be taxed. Then you take away your capital gains tax free allowance, and then this is the amount that is taxable. And if this amount is within your basic income tax band, then you'll pay 10% on any gains, 18% if it's residential property, or you'll pay 20% on any amount that's above the basic rate tax band, or 28% if it's residential property. So people might not realise that the way the calculation works is an interaction with how much you earn in terms of income. Now, from April 2023, so 6th of April 2023, the CGT allowance will drop from £12,300 to £6,000, and then from the 6th of April 2024, it will drop to £3,000. So there were people who asked me, are there things you should be doing now ahead of this April from a tax perspective because the allowances are dropping and becoming less generous? Before I move on to the answer to that question, the other tax allowance that changed I mentioned was the dividend tax allowance. So at the moment, you can earn £2,000 a year in terms of dividends that won't be taxed. That's dropping to £1,000 from the 6th of April 2023, and then £500 from the 6th of April 2024. Generally, there's not a lot you can do about that unless you want to change the way you generate income in any way, but the taxation rates still remain the same. And I'll just give you an example. There probably won't be much that people will do that will be different, because let's say you had somebody who was a director of a private company, so they pay themselves a salary and a dividend from their company profits, which is typical. So they'll pay themselves a salary of, say, £12,570, which is the personal income tax allowance, that's therefore tax-free, and then they pay themselves in dividends, which they then are taxed on. Now, the rate at which you're taxed is 8.75% on anything in the basic rate and 33.75% on anything that falls into the higher rate tax band. So what does that mean in reality for this person? Well, currently they would pay a total amount of tax of £5,587.50 in this tax year. When the dividend tax band falls to £1,000 next year, that is £5,675. And the year after, when it falls again to £500, when the dividend tax allowance falls again, this time to £500, the total tax they will pay is £5,718.75. Or in other words, they'll be £88 worse off in the 23-24 tax year and £131.25 worse off compared to this year in the 24-25 tax year. So it's not really anything significant. Now, going back to CGT, because the changes make a difference, what can you do, or what should you be thinking about doing given that the falls are significant? Well, it's not a lot, because I read around, looked at lots of stuff. I even spoke to people within the industry who advise a lot of wealthy people what were their views on what we could do. And the general advice stays the same as what it would do in any given tax year. So for example, you might look to make sales before the year end to use your tax allowance now. So the greater CGT allowance of £12,300. That makes sense. Obviously, if you have any losses in this tax year, they would be set against your gains, as I described earlier, before you apply the allowance. So capital losses will be used to reduce your potential CGT bill, like you would do in any tax year. Going forward, that will probably be more interesting, because when the allowance falls, you may need to get a little bit smarter about using your losses. Now, interestingly, people might not realise you can carry forward capital losses indefinitely. You just need to report them within 4 years to HMRC of the end of the tax year in which they occurred. So you will still be able to use capital losses to potentially reduce your tax bill for CGT purposes in the future. One other thing to bear in mind, I talked you through the calculation of CGT earlier. I did that deliberately because what you should have picked up is the rate that you will pay would be determined by your income tax levels. So if you are going to be changing income, so you might be having income go up, it means you could actually pay a higher rate of CGT on a disposal. Now, if you have a choice when that disposal occurs, then you might want to plan ahead, because it means you could potentially pay a lower rate. Let's say your income is going to fall in the future, or if your income is going to go up, you might want to plan making disposals before then. Of course, none of this is advice. You need to go and speak to a financial advisor or a tax accountant who can explain this more and look at your own personal circumstances and give you advice. Of course, there are some people that might start thinking about deliberately creating losses. So if they have an investment that might be sitting on a loss, I mean, there'll be probably plenty of people that might have had investments over the last year or so that have, they might decide to crystallize some of those in order to offset some of their gains. Now, don't forget, if people sell an investment, so let's say they sell a fund, they can't buy it back the next day, having crystallized the loss, or in fact, if they were trying to crystallize a gain and then buy it back the next day, because they'll be deemed to have held it continually. HMRC are not silly. So what you have to do if you want to try and crystallize a gain because you want to use your allowance, or some people might decide to crystallize losses to offset against gains, you can't buy the investment, the same one again, for 30 days. So you have to be out of it. And in that way, it isn't deemed to be the same investment. So that's okay. There are people who might go and buy a similar version of the thing that they held before, the fund, which is technically different, but they might go and buy something very similar. It's very easy if you're buying say you're in a tracker of some kind. The other thing that is probably more relevant this year than most is bed and ISA and bed and SIP. That is a way of getting around the 30-day rule effectively. Let's say you sell something, let's say a fund, outside of an ISA, so you've just got it maybe in a general investment account, and you buy it back the very next day within a SIP or an ISA. That is still counted as a disposal. You don't have to worry about the 30-day period. So there will be people who use that to crystallize a gain, therefore using their tax-free allowance in a year. And it also removes the investment from CGT altogether in the future because it's inside a tax-free wrapper, that is an ISA or a pension. And the other thing, of course, is don't forget to use your partner's allowances. So if you're married or in a civil partnership, you can transfer assets between each other without causing any CGT or tax implications. And so you can do that and they can make the disposal and they can therefore use their allowance. Everybody has their own capital gains tax allowance. And going forward, the other thing that's really going to make a difference is that more people are going to have to report capital gains, because as the allowance falls, it brings more people into that capital gains tax regime. More people are going to be liable to capital gains tax, so they will have to start reporting them on a self-assessment. So again, that's something to bear in mind going forward. Actually, I was about to move on again. I've done it twice. Actually, I think I often do it. I suddenly have another thought that comes to my mind about the piece I'm just finishing. And this, again, isn't an advice, but it's just anecdotal that there are people out there who are advising wealthy clients who are starting to talk to clients and mention that they might want to think about completing sales and paying tax before January 2024 because there's an election coming up. So they are worried that if Labour gets in, they may increase the CGT rates or they'll cut the allowances. So make of that as you will. Again, I say that's not advice or anything like that. But why I mention it, because it gives you some interesting insight into the conversations that happen between advisors and their wealthy clients. Because I remember when I used to work in the city, there would be conversations like that at meetings where they were worried about the implications of, say, Labour getting in and taxation rules being changed, and they start to make decisions just to keep their wealth. But there you go.
Okay, so let's finish off the podcast then with our final piece. And you've been busy doing some research for 80/20 members, and there's some research that come off of income portfolios and income funds, and you're going to share that on the pod.
Yeah, so every year I do this annual piece of research where I look at all of the funds out there from the sectors that are global equity income funds, so funds that are deliberately designed to pay out income but invest all over the world, UK equity income funds. I do it for investment trusts. I also do it for alternative assets, so unit trusts that invest in things like property, UK bonds, global bonds, and the managed multi-asset funds out there that are designed to produce an income stream. And go back to podcast 356, which was a year ago. I listened to that episode before doing today's episode, and it was a really good piece. I mean, that sounds a bit odd talking about yourself and saying it was really good, but I listened to it and there was quite a bit of insight in that episode about how funds can boost the payouts. You hear these funds called enhanced income and stuff like that. How do they do it? And there was so much insight into that about the way income funds work and when you're building a portfolio. I even explained things called covered call options, which sound very complicated, but when you understand them, they actually make sense. So from that podcast, I talked about don't just focus on yields, diversify beyond the UK if you've got an income portfolio, and also make sure you look at investment trusts because their structure and the way they work makes them very good at producing reliable income streams. Now, the point of all the research is for those people who want to make an income portfolio, so a portfolio that will pay out a steady stream of income going forward. They may be in retirement, they might just want to live off their investments. It doesn't exclude capital growth, but the priority is income generation. And the key thing is, if you want to live off of an income stream from an investment portfolio, then you want to make sure that grows with inflation over time. Otherwise, what will happen is your income will be static, inflation will run away, and we're all getting a dose of reality of that at the moment with inflation being high, and it means that we can afford less stuff. Imagine that happens over years, then you'd be getting poorer in real terms. So you want to invest in things that can grow income over time. And the best way of doing that is to invest in equity income funds. It does mean your portfolio's capital will go up and down. If you're drawing off the income, filling up a cash reserve in, say, a SIP or an ISA, and you are therefore drawing an income out of that reserve. So you're keeping that buffer filled up. The dividends, they come in irregularly. Some funds pay monthly, some pay quarterly, some pay 6 monthly or annually. It fills up that reserve, and then you're drawing down an income stream off that. Because don't forget, funds income streams aren't guaranteed. So if there is a pandemic like we had, companies out there will start making less money, will declare less dividends, which means the funds that invest in all those companies will start receiving less income, which they can then pay out to investors. So income streams aren't guaranteed. So by having a buffer of 1 or 2 years income in your SIP or ISA, which you actually draw your money from that you want to live off, and you just allow that to be naturally topped up by the yield that comes in off of your funds, hopefully you can smooth out any ups and downs. Now, what I want to talk about quickly today is some of the insight that came from 2022's numbers. So I analysed the actual pounds and pence payouts by all the different funds in 2022, and I've done this for years now, and I look back at 2021, and if with the unit trusts, actually I go back as far as 2007, so before the financial crisis, and there are funds out there that have managed to keep growing their payouts year on year, and actually they've done it in a way that in some cases beats inflation, which is unbelievable. And there are one or two investment trusts out there that have done this for decades. So let me start with bonds, UK bonds to start actually. The yield at the moment is 3.93%. Compare that to a year previously, it was 2.85%. So there's been a big increase. Look at global bond funds, the average yield at the moment is 3.4% versus 2.1% a year earlier. Now that might sound quite attractive given that the yield on bond funds has been low. Now, I say it might look attractive because if you look at UK equity income funds, the yield on the UK equity income fund at the moment is 4.4% versus 4.04% last year. Global equity income, it's 3.32% versus 2.9% last year. And investment trust, it's 4.4% versus 4.26%. So you can see there's been a decent jump in bond yields, but not so much in equity incomes, a marginal increase. To complete the picture, property funds, their yield went from 2.78% last year to 3.58% this year, and managed funds are broadly moved from 1.8% to 2.1%. So there's not much difference there. So you're looking at that and thinking, well, actually, I get almost as good a yield on bond funds now as I do on equity income funds. Now, that's an interesting point because one of the things that starts to put a dampener on equity markets at some point is when yields on fixed assets start to rise to levels where people look at them and go, I can get a yield on a bond, which is generally a lower risk asset than if I buy these shares. So why would I buy the shares? I'd buy the bonds. That is something you may hear more and more of in the future because bonds start to become more attractive. One thing is ask yourself, why is the yield better? And part of that is a function of the disaster that was 2022 from an investment perspective. If we look at the performance, the average performance of a fund in the UK equity income sector since the start of 2022 to now, which is the beginning of March 2023, it's up 3.9%. Global equity income, it's up 1.7%. Now, if we go to the bond sectors, global bonds down 8.9%. Sterling high yield bonds down nearly 9%, strategic bond funds in the UK down 11%, and normal corporate bonds are down 15%. I daren't go into what the gilts are doing. Now, yield is a function that's based upon the price you paid for an investment and the income that's paid out. So that's why the yield on the equities in the UK now isn't a great deal better than it was last year because the price at the moment is the same or has gone up and the income you're getting has increased, but it's not necessarily increased significantly. Overall, if you look at the bond funds, they fell hard last year, which means that their yield now looks attractive. And so if you're an income investor, you might be looking at those and thinking that's interesting. Take it one step further. Don't forget annuity rates are based off of gilt yields. People have started to buy annuities more in retirement because of that attractive income that is based off of gilt yields. But then, of course, we don't know that bond funds aren't going to fall further. I mean, we can say that about equity funds too. But don't just focus on the yield. Ask yourself, why is the yield now looking attractive? And it's not because necessarily the fund manager has done anything great. If you look at bond funds, it's very unusual because bond fund payouts grew last year. And when I say that, look at UK bonds, 75% of the funds grew their payouts. The previous year, 2021, 80% of them cut their payouts. In 2020, again, that's going to be the pandemic. It was 75% cut. But even before the pandemic, 60% cut their payouts in pounds and pence compared to the year previously. So the message still stands that if you want a growing income stream, you do need to focus on equity income funds. Bond funds don't produce a growing, reliable income stream over the long term, but they can be a diversifier. And there are people who are going to find them attractive now. if they're investing for income. Because you're investing for income, capital ups and downs are less of a concern. With bonds, it's about credit risk and whether you're going to still be paid. Now, of course, we don't know what's going to happen going forward. Bond funds hold hundreds of bonds in some instances, and so they diversify the risks. Something that obviously doesn't happen if people invest in retail bonds directly, which is a word of warning. If we're hitting a recession, then defaults could go up. But equity income funds do tend to produce a growing income over time. Interestingly, as part of the research, I look at the average increase over the last 5 years. So we've had some pretty ropey years when it comes to payouts. Interestingly, UK equity income funds on average have seen their payouts fall 1.8% a year over the last 5 years. Global equity income funds, they've increased on average 2.28%, and investment trusts have grown theirs on average 3.9% a year over the last 5 years. That is pretty impressive. So it just shows you, again, looking at investing for income, you've got to focus on investment trusts. Now, you can, of course, go and see all of these heat maps if you want to, if you subscribe for a free trial of 80/20 Investor. But there you go, Andy. There are some numbers there that you've got to feel what the average for different fund types are and different asset types when it comes to yield, what's above average and below average if you're looking and researching those funds, but also some areas to look for opportunities.
Okay, so that's it. We're done for this week. If you want to contact Damien, you can do so in the usual way, damien@moneytothemasses.com. If you've got any feedback for the show or any ideas for future episodes, then do get in touch with me. It's andy@moneytothemasses.com. Don't forget that the Grow It series will be going out throughout March on Tuesdays and Thursdays. You've already had episode 1. Episode 2 is coming out in just a couple of days. And so that's it. Damien, we are done for this week. Until next time.
Until next time.